Hello, JPU family. Welcome to another episode of Jamaica Politics Uncovered. Guys, I want to share this session of the Senate with you. I find it interesting, and I think you will too. Yeah, man, election is definitely in the air, and I think both sides are ready. One side is saying, hey, we don't want to hear nothing more, just call the election because we're tired of you. And the next side I say, listen, we don't have nothing to put to the Jamaican people. This is what we have done. Guys, have a listen and make sure you leave your comments so I can see what you all think of it. If you like the video, give it a thumbs up and make sure that you share it with somebody. Have a listen.
Prepared a speech this morning, but we have long tuned out of this government as the Jamaican people have tuned them out. Let them talk, let them talk, let them talk. What the people are waiting for is for them to call the elections so we can vote them out. And that's all I have to say this evening. The speech is here, talking about growth, taxes, but we don't need to. The people are ready to vote out when the innings done. Call it, Andrew, call it.
Mr. President, this debate on the appropriation bill for the 2025-2026 fiscal year directly precedes what will be one of the most consequential general elections in Jamaica's history. It is decision time. Jamaica's successes must not be imperiled. The gains we have secured and the strides we have made over successive political administrations must not be reversed. Jamaica must continue to move forward into a bright, sustainable, and prosperous future. We must not go backwards. And so, as we propel to decision-making time, action time, we on this side, Mr. President, invite the Jamaican people to carefully consider what is happening, and we urge them to choose Jamaica. Mr. President, Jamaica's key macroeconomic indicators are extremely encouraging. We have heard of unemployment being at record lows. We know what is happening with respect to debt to GDP, coming in at 68.7% by end of the current financial year. Inflation is in the order of 4.7%, within the lower band of the targeted inflation range by the Independent Central Bank. Policy interest rate has been coming down. Our net international reserves are robust, essentially at record levels. We have a stable dollar, and importantly, Mr. President, notwithstanding those who would seek to decry and shout down Jamaica, the Jamaican economy is projected to return to growth in the first quarter of 2025 calendar year. The stability and resilience we enjoy have not come about by chance. They have come on the back of hard work, steely resolve, discipline, and responsible actions by an active and strong government. A caring government, a fiscally responsible government, a government led by the best and the most effective Prime Minister in the history of Jamaica. Even in an election year, Mr. President, we are being fiscally responsible. We are not running with it. Mr. President, there is no doubt that notwithstanding the political divide, both the Jamaica Labour Party government and the opposition PNP want Jamaica to get to the same destination ultimately. ultimately. Believe it or not, even Senator Brown wants Jamaica to get to a particular destination ultimately. Where the stark divergence emerges, Mr. President, is as to how we propose to get there. Our approach is to maintain economic stability, give dividends to the worthy and deserving Jamaican people, boost economic activity, and foster accelerated growth, and generate even more tax revenues without imposing new taxes, which will ultimately create a brighter, more prosperous future for every Jamaican, even those yet to be born. On this side, Mr. President, we are proud that we have presented 9 consecutive budgets with no new taxes. The opposition PNP purports to be committed to fiscal discipline, but it is not in their DNA. IMF imposed fiscal discipline, as we saw between 2013 and February 2016, is not the ultimate measure of fiscal discipline. True discipline, Mr. President, is what you do and how you operate when there is no big stick hanging over your head. For appropriate context as to why the hard-fought gains we have secured by responsibly managing our fiscal affairs must be protected and any risk to our fiscal discipline stoutly resisted, it is good to note where we are coming from and where the journey to where we are today started. Making his contribution as he opened the 2009-2010 budget debate on Tuesday, 23rd April 2009, Mr. President, the venerable and indefatigable Audley Manayard Shaw, in a chapter captioned Economic Framework and Initiatives to Improve Governance, said the following, and listen keenly. The Jamaican economy has a number of fundamental structural weaknesses. The good gentleman was speaking in April 2009. I'm going to start again. The Jamaican economy has a number of fundamental structural weaknesses. These weaknesses have been highlighted by the global economic crisis, but they are not caused by the crisis. In fact, they are a function of our own policies and have existed unaddressed for decades. The major weaknesses include large, persistent fiscal deficits, and as a consequence, one of the highest levels of debt in the world. This crisis provides a wake-up call to the Jamaican society. It also presents an opportunity to focus our collective efforts on addressing these issues head-on. And this is an important observation now. We have developed, Audley Shaw said, speaking back in April of 2009, a framework to address the following key reforms: controlling public sector balances and debt, rationalizing public bodies, improving central government financial management and budget processes, increasing revenue collection, increasing growth and competitiveness, managing the public sector wage bill. This reform agenda is in support of the core economic framework to which we are committed: a sound, predictable macroeconomic policy, disciplined and strong fiscal management of the economy, a tax system that is simplified and equitable, a modern labor market geared towards high levels of productivity, a simplified business-friendly bureaucracy, effective measures to prevent corruption and fight crime, and supportive infrastructure. And in a chapter captioned debt management, the then Finance Minister Ardlishaw said the following: "The intensified engagement of multilaterals is a major component of our debt management strategy. In a short period of time, this policy produced real results. Since assuming office just over 19 months ago, this administration has sourced significant multilateral credit in both project and policy-based loans. The timing of these efforts has been fortuitous. Given the depressed state of the international capital markets, it is unlikely that these funds could have been sourced privately. Certainly, they could not have been sourced at such favorable terms. Not only have we been able to access credit at attractive interest rates, we have been able to secure longer repayment terms. To date, we have successfully negotiated a total of US $951 million in credit from the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the Caribbean Development Bank." End of quote. Mr. President, what caused the then Finance Minister Ardlishaw to have felt it necessary, important, instructive to say the things I quoted just now? Mr. President, the greatest transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich in this country is among those things that caused him to have made the observations he made. Who among us who occupies a space in this chamber benefited from the destructive and unsustainable high interest rate policies of the 1990s to mid-2000s? Who is the taponaris who occupies a place in this chamber who benefited from the largest transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich in this country? When asked about the sordid, vexing, and polarizing debacle that is the financial sector collapse of the mid to late 1990s, which culminated in the creation of FinSac, opposition leader Mark Golding, instead of exhibiting contrition, instead of assuming a posture of penitence and taking the opportunity to unreservedly apologize on behalf of the PNP he leads to the people of Jamaica for ruining our country's public finances and many businesses and lives, he remarked at a PNP press conference just 2 days ago the following: "I had no role in FinSac whatsoever. I was in the private sector there. I was an attorney at law and I was involved in business as well." So you know, that was an environment that we all had to navigate as people who were in the sector at the time, and we did it skillfully enough that we never had to ask FinSac for any support. Oh, what a tangled web we weave when we practice to deceive. While the opposition leader had an "it wasn't me" moment like Shaggy, speaking at a Gleaner's editorial editors forum on his antecedents in terms of how he came to be involved in politics and the PNP, opposition leader Mark Golding, notwithstanding what he said 2 days ago at a press conference when a certain question was put to him, he said the following, speaking some time ago at a Gleaner editors forum, Mr. President. Quote, "I came into the party through Dr. Omar Davies because I knew him in the financial sector, where I had been like one of the leading corporate lawyers in Jamaica and very involved in financial engineering." That's a code, by the way. And so, when he was the Minister of Finance, a lot of things that required industry input, I was one of the representatives of the industry that he would deal with. I got to know him through that, and that's how I came into the PNP. Make of that what you will, Mr. President. And I would make that same point to Jamaica. Indeed, I would commend the financial gleaner of Friday, December 5, 1997, to colleagues in this chamber and indeed to the public at large. And that particular report has the following caption: FinSac to pump $85 million into Billy Craig. I'm commending that for your readership. Mr. President, critics and cynics the world over assert that one of the more unsavory features of politics and electioneering is that politicians campaign in poetry and govern in prose. P-R-O-S-E, prose. We have been hearing on the political platform from the opposition PNP, and more so in this process aimed at passing the 2025-2026 budget, a lot of poetry. Pie in the sky promises, if you may. Their bombast, reckless and vulgar promises smack of political desperation and underscores considerable contempt for the Jamaican people. And it is a telling indicator, Mr. President, that the PNP cannot be trusted. This 2025-2026 budget exercise is of particular moment. It is of particular significance, Mr. President. That it is the last budget exercise before the upcoming general elections, which is constitutionally due by September of this year, means that the debate this time around is of added significance. What is it that the parliamentary opposition has sought to hide? Why did they not see it fit to come to the Jamaican people and present a budget that was at least costed, so that a determination could be readily made as to whether their pie-in-the-sky promises are in fact credible, achievable, and sustainable? If you are trying to sell something while holding back pertinent details regarding what you are selling, you cannot be trusted. Based on what we have seen and based on what we have heard from the PNP in the budget debate, Mr. President, they cannot be trusted. One of our more surgical and probing journalists put the following question to the opposition leader at the hurriedly called and convened PNP press conference 2 days ago. The journalist asked, "You pointed out that obviously your priorities would not be the same as the government currently in power. And certainly there are things that you don't have access to in terms of information. But clearly you should, as you see in opposition, areas where the government has put their priorities that you feel can be deprioritized to implement your programs. What would be those areas?" Mr. President, it's a reasonable question. An extremely important question. Well, the response to that question by the opposition leader was the following, and I quote, "I don't want to comment on that now, because we have to look at every line item when we come into office carefully. And there are some things that we may defer, some things that we may accelerate. There are some things that we may discontinue, and I don't want to attempt to foreshadow that yet. But I am confident that we will find the 6.4% of the $360 billion to pay for what we have come up with." Mr. President, the wild promises from the PNP are not made carefully. They were not made carefully, but in a bid to evade scrutiny and avert further public ridicule in light of how fiscally imprudent their pie-in-the-sky promises outlined in the budget debate are, Mark Golding, the opposition leader, is telling Jamaica that he would have to think carefully about what areas he would propose to deprioritize, scale down, or discontinue were he to be elected to office in this country. Mr. President, Mark Golding and the PNP are seeking to sell the Jamaican people a puss in a bag. The people should reject them. The people should reject their puss in a bag, as they, the PNP, simply cannot be trusted. Andrew Holness presented a prospectus. Mark Golding presented a puss in a bag. Mr. President, whether they want to characterize the contributions we heard from Julian Robinson and Mark Golding over the past 2 weeks as a budget presentation or a manifesto presentation, the Jamaican people are being urged to note and understand that a budget or manifesto is only as good as the degree to which it is credible. Mr. President, a budget or a manifesto is only as good as the degree to which the persons proposing it have the ability, capacity, and proven track record to deliver on it without mashing up the country. Mr. President, when the PNP now attacks us left, right, and center, as they did between January 2012 and February 2016, when they heaped just about $60 billion in new taxes on the backs of us, on our backs as taxpayers. The PNP is busy mashing up the country through destructive and unsustainable policies, including their propensity to run with it, as we witnessed throughout the 90s and into the 2000s. Mr. President, the PNP cannot be trusted. The PNP's pie-in-the-sky promises are not credible and would imperil our country's hard-fought economic successes and bring the collective sacrifice we have all had to make over the years to naught. Mr. President, they are proposing to give up so much on the revenue side. For example, $11.4 billion from the NHT, asset tax, employment tax credit, to the extent that they propose to increase it from 30% to 40%. But what is curious, Mr. President, is that notwithstanding the considerable revenue flows that they are proposing to give up, that same desperate PNP turn around and are promising to do so much on the expenditure side. Them promising this and that and every single what's it not. They talk about a pro-box moment. Well, what the PNP is putting on the table, Mr. President, constitutes a tricks you moment. Their suite of policy proposals and how they plan to implement them and how they envisage them working, Mr. President, is simply not cogent, it is simply not coherent, it is simply not credible, and it is simply not compelling. They are proposing, Mr. President, to party with the rent money. And Jamaica cannot stand by and allow that to happen. The people of Jamaica must reject the backwardness of the PNP, and the people of Jamaica, I dare say, must choose Jamaica, Mr. President. Mr. President, consequent on the PNP's massive political error in presenting pie-in-the-sky promises without appropriate costing, they have been the subject of considerable public ridicule. They have been the subject of considerable mockery. They have been the subject of considerable castigation. And Mr. President, they have been, the PNP that is, the subject of considerable pushback by the public. It is not surprising, Mr. President, to find that in circumstances where the proverbial light is now being shone on the PNP and its pie-in-the-sky promises, and they are now under microscope-like scrutiny. They are now being intensely interrogated. The opposition PNP, Mr. President, led by Mark Golding, they are now seeking to moderate and walk back their ridiculous pie-in-the-sky promises. They are now seeking, Mr. President, to pivot from platform bombast and wild promises, that is, campaigning in poetry, to a deliberate and tactical scaling down or walking back, if you may, of their promises in order to suppress and deflate the fiscal price tag of what it is that they have been promising. Mr. President, I suppose this is their whimsical attempt to transition from poetry to prose. Mr. President, as the opposition spokesman on education, Senator Damion Crawford, for at least a year now, has been on the political platform several times over, making certain promises regarding the provision of meals and boarding facilities at schools. Speaking at the PNP's annual conference on Sunday, 15th of September 2024, Senator Damion Crawford, yes, the same gentleman who detained us for a little over 2 hours this morning and has found it convenient to make his way elsewhere, having detained us. Yes? He said the following, and I'm quoting Senator Crawford here, Mr. President. The first thing we are going to do, I'm quoting Senator Crawford here, Mr. President. The first thing we are going to do is make sure we have boarding facilities for at least 30% of our school population. And then we are going to give 1 meal per child in school. That's what he said. That was at the PNP's conference in September of 2024. Then speaking, Mr. President, at the PNP's presentation of its candidate for the Southwest St. Anne constituency on Sunday, 19th January 2025, merely a few weeks ago, Mr. President, Senator Crawford issued the following charge to vuvuzela-blowing comrades. And I quote, "On the campaign trail, I want you to remind the people that we are having an election between 1 meal per child in school and 3 meals per adult in prison. The JLP will tell you you cannot afford to give every child a meal. But when the child, they find 3 meals for an adult," end quote. Mr. President, that is what Senator Crawford said when he was in poetry mode. But now that it is crunch time, where there is a demand for the hard, unadulterated numbers, given budget season and the pending general elections, Senator Crawford and the pie-in-the-sky promising PNP, of which he is a part, has gone into prose mode, pivoting from poetry mode to prose mode. They know that the proverbial light is now being shone, and that their pie-in-the-sky promises are now under microscope-like scrutiny. So what have they done, Mr. President? What have they done as they pivot from poetry mode to prose mode. Well, at a hastily called and convened press conference 2 days ago, at a hastily come on. At a hastily called and convened press conference 2 days ago, after a proper shellacking from our first woman finance minister the previous day, Senator Crawford and the PNP vastly walked back the pie-in-the-sky promises they were making previously. First of all, Mr. President, in what they are now presenting, the much talked about establishment of boarding facilities for 30% of our students has suddenly gone through the window. No more talk of that. Yet, in his What Can Go So speech at party conference in September of 2024, he spoke about that. There is yet another glaring example. This is yet another glaring example, Mr. President, that the PNP cannot be trusted. Secondly, on the matter of providing meals to our students, Senator Crawford spoke to and presented costing for something entirely different from what he and the PNP have been saying for several months prior on the political platform. In a classic tricks you moment, Senator Crawford and the PNP are now pivoting from poetry mode to prose mode as the political platform promise of providing at least 1 meal per day to every child at the primary and secondary level has now gone through the window, with the PNP in an attempt to moderate the fiscal cost, now promising instead to provide a meal solution to every needy student. Tricks you again, Mr. President. This demonstrates that the parliamentary opposition is being merely expedient, politically desperate, and contemptuous of the Jamaican people. And as such, Mr. President, the PNP cannot be trusted. The people of Jamaica should reject them and instead choose Jamaica. So suddenly, promise of at least 1 meal per day to students at the primary and secondary levels not only pertain to an estimated 246,400 students, ostensibly the 56% facing food insecurity at a cost of 18 billion, as opposed to catering to the entire student population as they previously promised. So instead of the entire student population, they have now walked it back, Mr. President, because the light is being shone on them and they're being held. Their feet is being held to the fire. They're now scaling it back to say, well, based on the Food and Agriculture Organization study and report in recent times, the 56% of our people who are considered as facing food insecurity is essentially the target group that they're going to be using. This is a vast, yes, scaling back of what they had promised, Mr. President. But it is not surprising. Using Senator Crawford's own numbers regarding the student population, which is 440,000 students, he says, the cost of providing at least 1 meal per day to them, with each meal costing $400 based on what he has expressed, over the 190 feeding days would be a massive $33.5 billion, Mr. President. So just to be very clear, what they presented at their press conference Wednesday, this past Wednesday, was a price tag of 18 billion. But it is 18 billion because they have essentially pivoted away from what they were saying on the campaign stump, on the political platform for several months now. They were promising a free meal solution to every child in our schools. But because They have heard from the people of Jamaica and they are being lambasted all over social media and elsewhere. They have sought to scale it back. When in fact, based on the original promise, based on the original pie in the sky plan that they had, the price tag would really have been $33.5 billion. Mr. President, amid this tricks you moment, our retort is to point out to Senator Crawford and the politically desperate PNP that tricks are for kids. Mr. President, cost suppression tactics were also used by Senator Crawford and the PNP in relation to its long-promised first in the family to university proposal. To the extent that a scholarship from, and this is a key bit of analysis, Lame, they may learn something.
Man, I bring the introduction to a closing. Introduction.
To the extent rather, that a scholarship from the government would go a far way in removing one of the binding constraints on tertiary enrollment, which is tuition, as you can appreciate. Instead of predicating one's calculation as to fiscal costs on Jamaica's tertiary enrollment rate, it would have been more appropriate to predicate the costing on what I consider tertiary eligibility. Mr. President, tertiary enrollment has to do with those who actually go to or enroll at university. Tertiary eligibility, Mr. President, has to do with those who meet the matriculation requirements, many of whom, owing to socio-economic challenges, because they come from Tapanari's households, elect to go into the world of work, with some of them ultimately going on to pursue tertiary level training at some later point in life. So just to be clear, based on the regime that currently obtains, Jamaicans require a visa to travel to the United States. Persons who hold a US visa, yes, are potential travelers to the United States. So they would be considered as persons eligible to travel to the United States. However, not everybody who holds a US visa actually travels to the United States. So it's the same concept with this tertiary student business. So those who enroll are the persons who constitute the tertiary enrollment cohort. But those who meet the matriculation requirements and could present for a space at tertiary are what I am considering the tertiary eligible. Because as you can appreciate, because of financial challenges, persons who may well be eligible may well elect not to present for a place at tertiary because they simply consider themselves as not being able to afford it. Yes? So, Mr. President, it is my information that the grade 11 cohort for the 2024 sitting of CSEC was 33,564 students. Some 11,356 of them, Mr. President, obtained passes in 5 or more subjects with math and or English, which means that they satisfied the matriculation requirement for entry into a degree program at one of our tertiary training institutions. Now, being conservative, Mr. President, if you were to add some of the persons in our society who are or who were previously eligible for tertiary level training as they meet the matriculation requirements, we could put the indicative degree training cohort at 12,000. Again, Mr. President, using Senator Crawford's own estimates and parameters, let us say just about a quarter of that 12,000 would happen to be first in their family to university, thereby qualifying for the PNP's promise. 3,000 students at the annual tuition cost of 600,000, using again the figure that he used at the press conference. So using that figure as the average cost of tertiary level training, because as we are aware, there are other programs at the university that cost well in excess of $1 million and are more expensive. Programs like medicine, of course, to the extent that it is not UGC subsidized, programs like law, at the Faculty of Law on the Mona campus, for example, and other programs like engineering and so on. But we're using the 600,000 that the good late Trixie Senator used at the press conference. Yes? So, considering the 3,000 students who would be eligible, Mr. President, at a cost of 600,000 over the 4-year period, as per Senator Crawford's calculations, that would actually come out using these numbers at a tune of 7.2 billion Jamaican dollars, not the 3.9 billion Jamaican dollars that Senator Crawford articulated at the PNP's hurriedly convened press conference this past Wednesday. But it doesn't end there, Mr. President. It doesn't end there. The Tricks You crew, the Run With It crew, the Cannot Be Trusted crew must be made to tell us what of the other costs associated with accessing tertiary education, which includes, of course, boarding and accommodation, meals, books and supplies, and laptop computer. The Tricks You crew and the Run With It crew must tell us that. Mr. President, it is my considered view that all things factored, the SLB reforms articulated by the governing JLP are more fit for purpose, sustainable, and fiscally superior to the pie-in-the-sky proposal the PNP is presenting. Because what have we done with the SLB? And you would have heard other speakers touching on it throughout this debate. We're providing support via the SLB, where, of course, the guarantor requirement has been abolished. We're providing support on the tuition fee side, but we're also providing support for accommodation, meals, books and supplies, and of course a laptop computer. Because what would university life be, quite frankly, without access to at least a laptop computer? Another technical one, maybe a bit over your head, but watch this one, Lamy. We're dealing here now with deposits held by the BOJ.
Yes, people, the biggest mistake, grave error in judgment of the PNP was to attend that budget debate without a clear alternative budget. Biggest mistake, because now you can't walk back not being able to tell the people how you're going to fund certain things.